May 29, 1858, Hartford Weekly Times, Hartford, Connecticut. A story of second sight in Sweden. From the New York Spirit of the Times. The narrative about to be related is more than usually well authenticated, and deserves an attentive perusal. It is extracted from an old German manuscript, included among a number of other documents left by Count Horn, a celebrated Swedish minister, towards the close of the last century, to the University of Gothenburg, in the archives of which it has been found by the Chevalier Engström, who a few years ago was British consul there. The paper in question is written in choice Latin, and is evidently the production of no commonly accomplished person. The results, with only a few of the reflections, are given in the strange narrative that ensues, which certainly is one of the most startling that has ever met within modern times. For to the formal document on which it is founded, the names of 6 witnesses of high family and character were annexed. It may be added also that the tale was current for a century in Sweden, and cited as ominous long before the events received their accomplishment. But to the point. Charles XI of Sweden, who, as all the world knows, was the father of the great Charles XII, that long proved a successful rival to Peter the Great, was a downright despot, and yet as wily and as sage a sovereign as ever presided over the court of Stockholm. Oligarchical before, the country, hitherto ruled by nobles and wealthy burghers, yielded at once to its sovereign, who forced the States General to confide the entire power to himself, who, though enlightened beyond his age, noble-spirited, and sincerely attached to the Lutheran religion, was, on the other hand, cold, dogged, inflexible, and simply a man of facts without judgment or imagination. At the time of which we speak, he had just lost his unhappy consort, Eleanor Ulrica, and although report said that his own harshness and cruelty towards that lady had hastened her end, he showed his esteem for her memory by a grief more touching than could have been expected from a nature made of stuff so stern as his. He evinced it, too, in his peculiar way, that most accorded with the nature of a stern and positive man. He became, in short, more stern and taciturn than ever, and, as his nature led him to state and military occupations, these were only the more increased, in order to distract his attention from the domestic calamities that had befallen him. The early gloaming of a late autumn, when the wind and sleet gave dreary presage of a quick approaching winter, found this gloomy monarch in his cabinet at Stockholm, seated in his dressing robe and slippers, before a huge fire, such as, before the days of artificial warming, was indispensable in so cold a climate. Seated in his huge armchair, and thoughtfully leaning his head upon his upraised arms, he scarce perceived the presence of his chamberlain, the celebrated astronomer Tycho Brahe, who was the depository of all his secrets, and paid even less attention to his physician, Dr. Baumgarten, who, though he doubted of everything else, had the most implicit faith in medicine, and had so well succeeded in convincing the king of his ability, that on that very evening he had been summoned to give him advice and provide a cure from some real or imaginary disease. As courtiers should do, they patiently awaited the royal pleasure, but though the night drew on apace, the king, contrary to his custom, failed to wave his hand as a signal for their departure, for he was vacantly gazing on the fire, and though weary of his attendants, yet feared from some cause that he could not explain to be left alone. The count saw that his presence was far from agreeable, and had more than once hinted his fears that his majesty required repose, but a silent gesture kept him in place beside the monarch's chair. So likewise with Baumgarten. His profession seemed to give him the liberty of saying how injurious late hours might be to the king's health, But his only answer was, scarcely audible through the teeth, "The king will mind himself. Stay there, man, I am not sleepy yet." Such words from so absolute a monarch were conclusive, and the courtiers were compelled to try different subjects of conversation successively to keep their master's spirits up. But they all failed. The king, in short, was in one of his darkest and most revolting tempers, and this made the courtier's position not a little painful. As for Baumgarten, he remained silent. But the Count Bra, believing the king's sadness proceeded from grief at the loss of his queen, gazed for a while on a portrait of her hung near the fireplace. How striking the likeness, the expression too, uniting so much gentleness with true queenly dignity. Charles heard his mumbled words, and, supposing them intended as a sidelong reproach, such as he was wont to hear from many others, for his cold, unfeeling conduct towards his queen, just raised his head from his elbow and said, "Pshaw, man, thou art a fool," and sneering, as he rose from his chair and pointed to the picture, "Fool, fool, thou know'st yon portrait is but flattery. She was as ugly as—" And then, in a paroxysm of excitement and passion, he stamped his foot and walked about the room, as if to hide an agitation for which he might well have blushed, had it been his nature. He stopped, however, before a window looking out upon the court, and gazed on the moonlit scene around. The palace, now occupied by the kings of Sweden, was not yet completed, and Charles XI, who planned and began it, was still residing in the old place, situated just at the angle of Ritterholm that looks upon the Lake Muller. It was a large prison-like edifice. The king's private cabinet was in one of its wings, and nearly facing it was the great saloon, where the states assembled when summoned to receive any message from the crown. In this chamber it was that the king more particularly gazed, and, strange to say, its windows appeared to be brilliantly illuminated. He at first thought that this unusual light might proceed from the torches of some passing servants, but then what could they want at such an hour in a chamber that had not been opened for so long a time? Besides, the light was too bright, far too bright to proceed from a few passing torches. Neither could it be a fire, for there was no smoke, no appearance of destruction from the fiery element, no noise of alarm or crashing rafters. It could be nothing, then, but an illumination. The king gazed upon the windows for some minutes in silent astonishment, and his minister, Count Bra, who saw the strange phenomenon as well as himself, was about to ring a bell upon the table for a page, who might be sent to inquire the cause of a singular light. The king, however, stopped him. "No," said he, "I care for neither men nor spirits. I will go myself." At the same time, however, the count noticed that the monarch turned pale as if from a sort of religious awe. Nevertheless, his mind was fully bent to its purpose, and he went forth firmly, followed by his chamberlain and physician, who each bore a lighted candle as they ushered him across the court. The porter who had the keys had been long in bed, but Baumgarten awoke him and bade him, in the king's name, to open forthwith the doors of the chamber of the states. The poor man, only half awake, was astonished at so unexpected a request, but he instantly dressed himself and joined the king with his bunch of keys. They first opened a door leading to a gallery which served as a sort of antechamber to the grand saloon, and when the moody king entered it, great was his surprise to find the walls were hung with black. "Who has dared," said he, looking round with anger, "to order this chamber to be hung like this?" The porter trembled beneath his angry gaze and was unable to answer, for all he knew was that the last time he swept the apartments they were lined with oaken panels as usual, and he was not aware that any materials in His Majesty's wardrobe that could have been used to produce such a change. Charles went forward with nervous rapidity, crossing more than 2/3 of the long gallery, followed by the chamberlain and porter, for the doctor hung behind, having no relish for the possible consequences of an adventure so unquestionably strange, and which might be disastrous too. The porter was the first to speak, and his accents were those of terror. "Advance no further, sire. Depend on it, there's witness here. This is the hour at which, ever since the death of Her Majesty, whose memory heaven bless, a ghost, her spectre, walks the gallery. The Count, too, heard a noise as if coming from the state saloon beyond, while Baumgarten, whose candle a puff of wind had extinguished, proposed to fetch a body of the palace guard. "Cowards," said the king indignantly, "what fear ye? I will enter. Open instantly these doors, I say." And therewith he kicked against them with his foot, causing a sound which echoed like thunder through the empty apartments. The unhappy porter now trembled to such an extent that the keys rattled, and all his strength could not make the key enter the lock. "Pshaw," said the king, "an old veteran trembles as a child. Shame on you." And then turning to the Count, he bade him open the door. "Sire," said the chamberlain, retiring a step, "were your majesty to bid me to face a fire of Danish or Russian cannon, I would obey your orders instantly. But I cannot, dare not face the power of heaven or hell." Charles, thus hulked in his purpose, rudely snatched the keys from the porter. "Dastard," said he with a tone of contempt, "what fear you? This must, I see, be my affair alone." And before his attendants could advance to aid him, he had opened the thick oaken door of the saloon and entered it, invoking heaven with reverence to aid him in his work. Curiosity was now stronger than fear with his attendants, and all three followed him as if ashamed of the terror they had shown. How great was the surprise of all! The chamber of state appeared to be illuminated by a countless number of waxen lights, and the walls, which hitherto had been lined with antique tapestry representing events of Swedish history, were now hung with black. Along the walls, too, were hung in order numerous flags that had been taken as trophies by the soldiers of Gustavus Adolphus from the Germans, Danes, and Russians. But what was yet more strange, several Swedish banners might be perceived covered with funeral crape. On the benches that lined the chamber on either side sat an immense assembly, nobles, clergy, citizens, farmers, in short, the representatives of the four great orders of the state, and they were all clad in the deepest black. Their countenances, too, shone so brightly amid the somber hues by which they were surrounded that the eyes of the king and his four attendants were fairly dazzled as they looked, though none were able to recognize one single individual in the whole assembly, for all appeared like that undistinguished mass of human faces that an actor sees before him on the stage. At the further end was the throne from which the king was used to address the states, and on it they beheld a bleeding corpse attired in the insignia of royalty. To the right stood a boy with the crown on his head and holding a scepter in his hand, while on the other side was an aged man, or rather a spectre, who leaned against the throne and was clothed in the ceremonial dress worn by the state ministers of the court of Sweden before Vasa erected the republic into a kingdom. Fronting the throne again were several grave, austere-looking persons clad in long black robes, and seemed to be the judicial officers, for they were seated at a table whereon there were numerous ancient-looking folios and parchment documents. In front of the table, on the floor between the benches, was an execution block covered with crape, and on it rested a headsman's axe. The spectacle was awfully strange, and what was stranger still, no one in this ghostly assemblage appeared to recognize the presence of either Charles or his attendants. The only audible sound, indeed, which reached the ears of the latter was a confused murmur, but not an articulate word ever reached the ears of the astonished spectators. Presently, however, the oldest and gravest of the black-robed judges, who seemed to act as president of the assembly, solemnly rose and struck with his hand 3 times upon the folio before him. Instantly all was silence. Then several handsome youths in rich attire, but with their hands confined by ropes behind their backs, entered from the door opposite to that by which the king had just entered. They walked proudly and with bold, courageous step. But who was this strange being that followed them? He was a stalwart, muscular person, clad in a brown leather jerkin that closely fitted his person, and in his hand he held the end of the ropes by which the youths who walked before him were secured. When the prisoner who entered first, and seemed to be the chief, had reached the middle of the hall, he suddenly stopped before the block, on which he looked with infinite disdain. Meanwhile, the corpse upon the throne appeared to palpitate and tremble with a convulsive movement, and fresh red blood flowed from a wound in its side. The youth, then bidden by the headsman, kneeled before the block and placed his head thereon. The axe suddenly rose, glittering in its course, and fell with a noise that echoed through the building. A stream of blood flowed upon the floor and reached even the corpse upon the throne, while the head, rolling along the center of the hall, reached even the feet of Charles and bathed them with gore. The stern king had until now been silent with surprise, but the horror of the spectacle he had just witnessed gave utterance to his tongue. Advancing, therefore, upon the hall, he addressed the principal of the spectral ministers of state. "If thou be spirit sent from heaven, oh, speak to me. If goblin damned, depart in peace." The spectre, lifting his hands, solemnly and slowly replied, "Thou art Charles the 11th. Now mark, this blood shall not be spilt while thou art king, but 5 reigns afterwards. But woe betide the blood of Vasa." From that instant, the shapes of the numerous personages in the ghastly assembly began to be less vivid and distinct, disappearing altogether in a few brief minutes. The supernatural lights, too, around the chamber burned dim, and soon became extinguished, and when the chamber was lighted only by the flambeau borne by the king's attendants, they only dimly showed the tapestry with which the hall was hung. Still there was a murmuring sound, as of the wind moaning through the leaves of the forest, or of an Aeolian harp, and the king looked round with awe when he found the spectral scene enclosed. There was no doubt, however, that the appearance was supernatural, for when the Count and Baumgarten lifted on high their flambeaux to examine the chamber, the sable hangings, the block, the axe, the dissevered head, and the streams of blood which seemed to have deluged the floor had all disappeared with the rest, and the only proof of the reality of the scene was a deep stain of blood that marked the slipper of the king, who never forgot the events of that awful night. On re-entering his cabinet, Charles caused a statement of the facts to be formally drawn up, and it was signed by himself and the 3 attendants who had witnessed them. No little care was taken to hide the matter from the knowledge of the public, but the event had become generally known even before the death of Charles the 11th, and the words which he dictated at the close of the document are very remarkable. "If the narrative just given is not the real and unvarnished truth, I give up every hope of enjoying that better life which some of my deeds may have deserved, and especially my zeal for the public good and my solicitude for the interests of that religion which have long been professed by my ancestors." It only remains for us to add that this strange and supernatural prophecy received its fulfillment when Gustavus III, towards the close of the last century, 5 reigns afterwards, received his death at a masked ball from the pistol of the assassin Ancustrom. He was tried and condemned, and the youth who was beheaded before the spectral States General in this singular vision was no other than the murderer of Sweden's anointed king. The crowned corpse upon the throne was, therefore, Gustavus III. The boy on his right was his son and successor. And, lastly, the old man on his left must have been the Duke of Sudermans, the uncle of the last, who was first regent of the kingdom and then its sovereign after his nephew's deposition. We believe there is no instance in the history of any country of so extraordinary and so well authenticated a case of second sight, for it is seldom indeed that any second witness, and much less 4, can be found to guarantee the truth of so strange a phenomenon as that just recorded. Nota bene, this strange story has been already given by French, German, Danish, Swedish, and Russian writers, but the above is the only true version that has ever been offered to the American public. W.A.R.S. Markwell.